Welcome to the NC Choices webinar series, Teaching Tools for Beginning Farmers, funded by the United States Department of Agriculture's Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. I'm Matt Poore, and I'm going to be presenting the module on beef cattle production management. This is one of 7 modules offered in this webinar series. In this presentation, we'll talk about the beef industry. If you're interested in other resources offered by NC Choices, you can find out more on our website or on your YouTube channel. I'm Matt Poore from NC State Extension, and I'm here to present introductory information on beef cattle production for farmers that are considering entering the local beef business and need to know the basics of beef production. So this will be the first of a number of different presentations that will be that are designed to help you to understand the basics and then be prepared for more advanced learning materials later in the future. So the beef industry in the U.S. is a very segmented industry. There are actually beef cows spread across the entire country. Virtually every county in the country has beef cows. So it's something that is pretty much ubiquitous and helps to tie agriculture together all across the country. The segments that we normally think about for beef production are the cow-calf industry, where the brood cows or mother cows are kept and calves are born and raised, generally up through weaning. As I said, cows are all across the United States, and most of the calves from these farms are sold after they're weaned from the cow and enter the later segments of the industry. The next segment is the stocker industry, or we call the stocker phase of production. And in this type of production, the calves from cow-calf farms are purchased by our stocker operators. They are brought back to health, gotten over the stress of their marketing and weaning. They're taught to eat feed from a feed bunk and drink from a water tank. And then those calves then are prepared then to go on to the feedlot industry. Typically a calf would be anywhere from 3 to 6 months in a stocker operation after leaving the cow-calf farm. Finally, feedlot production is a very concentrated industry in the central part of the country, where calves and yearlings are fed in confinement feedlots. And those are largely located in the high plains, but these are large facilities, and I'll show you some pictures of those as we get into the presentation. Now, finally, the last thing I'll mention is the local beef industry or local beef production. This is kind of a new thing in the last 20 years, perhaps, that there's been a lot of interest in local foods, and people really want to know where their food came from. So if you think about the cow-calf, the stocker, and the feedlot industry that we have, when you go purchase a piece of meat at the grocery store, you really have no idea where that animal had been. Very good chance that it was born here in the Southeast, was moved perhaps to Tennessee or some other state for stocker production, then went to a feedlot in Kansas or Nebraska, and then ended up being harvested and packed in the Midwest, and then sold back here in the grocery store in North Carolina. So it's no wonder that there are people that are interested in buying a piece of beef that they know where the calves were born, they know how they were raised through the whole time, and they feel confident that they understand the production system. So that's really what we're here today to talk about it, but it's important that you know about the general structure of the beef industry when you start getting involved in developing your production system. Now, this slide basically shows a lot of what I had said before with the cow, where cows are concentrated in the U.S. The red areas are counties that have a high cow population, and you can see that these are concentrated in East Texas, eastern Oklahoma, parts of Arkansas and Missouri, and then in the Tennessee and North Carolina, Georgia area, Kentucky as well. There's also a lot of cows in Florida. So much different from what a lot of people think about the U.S. beef industry. Really, the cows are in the southeast, and the reason for this is because it is the best place to grow forages and to efficiently raise those cows. You go to the west and you think about the western range states. There are cows there, but they're very widely distributed. They have a very low density type of production in the western U.S. So if you wanted to put the grass production per acre on this same kind of map, you'd see that was in the southeast, is where the grass and the forages are best produced. Now this next slide shows a kind of a schematic of how animals move within this, this industry that we have. And so cow-calf farms or cow-calf production there being at the top. The next stage would be calf weaning. Sometimes that's done on the farm. Sometimes it's kind of skipped and done on the way to the market. And unfortunately, that's one of the high stress points that calves experience, is if they are taken directly from the cow and sold at a livestock market, so that when they enter that stocker cattle production, they've not undergone any kind of management to speak of. It's growing more and more common that these calves will be weaned on their farm of birth, and this would always be the case for replacement heifers. Those are the young females that are brought back into the herd as cows. But also for local finishing, that's the idea, is those calves are weaned on the farm. They're raised on the farm where they were born, or very close to that on another farm that is coordinating with that farmer where the calves are born, and then those go on into the local finishing. So really bypassing a lot of the steps in this particular flow chart. Also, if you notice, there are two different ways of entering the feedlot. Sometimes these are stocker cattle that have gone through that growth phase from 500 to 800 pounds on a forage or a byproduct-based diet, and then they enter the feedlot where they're fed high-grain diets. Or in many cases now, where they are weaned on the farm of origin, we call this preconditioning. Those calves are then sent directly to the feedlot and bypass a stocker part of the industry. So a lot of different ways animals can flow on this. But again, trying to help you get a basic understanding of how animals move within these systems. Just a photo here to kind of let me reinforce some of the points about cow-calf production. This is a scene from Southern Virginia, both a fall and a winter scene, and of course these cows are on pasture. They are housed in that way with very little structure like barns or anything like that. Low level of infrastructure is needed, and they are quite densely populated here in this part of the country. The next slide here sort of shows this is actually a group of calves being weaned and prepared to go to the feedlot. This demonstrates how they need to be taught to feed out of a feed bunk. This is something that they will never have experienced as calves. And so once they are taken from the cow, spending a little time with them and teaching them to eat feed will really help them to get over the stress of weaning and prepare to take that trip west to the feedlot. One thing to think and keep in your mind about transportation and how this is done. Transportation can be a stressful and potentially traumatic part of the life of the animal, and so we do everything we can to make these trucks safe. But the point I want to make here is this is a typical tractor trailer load of cattle would be about 48,000 pounds of cattle, and so if you think of a 550-pound calf, that's about 80 head would be on a truck like this. So while it seems inefficient to ship these animals long distances, when you put 80 on a single truck, then the cost per animal, or the miles per animal, if you will, are low. So while it seems inefficient, it is actually quite efficient to move these large quantities of calves to the feedlot, and then also the beef moving back in these large quantities. So as you contemplate the local beef business, remember that there is economy of scale in these systems that have been developed, and the challenge for a local beef producer is hauling one or two animals at a time, or either in the meat or in the live animal, and that can be a very inefficient process, and just need to be aware that that's a place where there's a lot of hidden costs that need to be considered because of the inefficiency of transportation. Now, just to give you a view of a feedlot, and again, lots of folks have never seen a feedlot and don't maybe understand what they are. But basically, it's a large set of pens that surround a feed mill. And so in this picture, you see the feed mill is where the large white silos are there in the middle. All of the feed for all of these animals is produced there in that feed mill. Generally, the mill will run 24 hours a day. And you'll have folks on site that will be hauling and moving feed to cattle throughout the day. The size of feedlots varies, but we're looking at somewhere between 10 and 50,000 head. One-time capacity is not an unusual size feedlot, so it's a lot of animals are concentrated. Now, this does lead to some concerns with environmental concerns, especially. You can imagine there's a lot of nutrients that go into a site like this that do not leave. They come out as manure, and so there's a lot of effort on manure collection and use in surrounding agriculture to try to get these nutrients distributed back out. But nevertheless, they are a source of they are a sink for nutrients. As well, there are other issues such as dust and mud potentially, and that sort of thing. That is a concern. Sometimes odor, obviously, for neighbors would be an issue if they'd not been grown up around this type of facility. But nevertheless, it's a very efficient system. These feedlots are located close to the packers that process the meat, and so it helps them to cut transportation costs back to the packer to be located close to them. Now, while there are some concerns that I've mentioned, we do hear a lot about animal welfare concerns with these types of feedlots and how animals are forced to to stay in these small pens and that sort of thing. But I just want to make sure that I impress on you, this is a typical feedlot steer here, and several of his pen mates that are laying there on what's called a mound. It's a mound of soil there in the middle of the pen, keeps them up out of the mud, keeps them dry, place that they like to lay. You'll notice on the top right of this slide, there's a picture of a pen that's just been cleaned and groomed, and there is a lot of working to maintain the surface of the pens to try to reduce dust and to try to make the animals as comfortable as possible. On the bottom right there's a feed bunk. Typically the way feed is presented to these animals, they have all the feed that they want, typically fed twice a day, but to as much as they want to eat. There's a nutritionist that looks over this feed ration periodically and has controlled and developed the ration to exactly meet the nutrient requirements of these animals. And so while we perceive, well, animals are not really meant to eat this way, well, there's a lot of science, a lot of efforts gone into making sure that this is good for the animal and that they are productive, and so that's a real benefit to the animal to have that excellent nutrition, as opposed to being out on pasture where it's a lot harder to meet nutrient requirements of animals, as we'll learn later in the course. So you can't, it's really not appropriate or healthy for us to think about what's this steer standing here thinking. They do not think like humans. They're not humans. But nevertheless, I spent my entire graduate school career working in feedlots and working with feedlot animals, and they are as content and as happy, if you will, as cows on my farm in deep grass. They're easy animals to please, and with low stress handling and constant care, you certainly can't argue that they have poor animal welfare in a feedlot system. Now, the next segment here I want to address with you is the type of production that we might see here in the southeast with cow-calf, and again, this is intended to give you a good idea of the overall beef industry, but I want to focus some on our southeastern systems because that's our the main thing that we want to work with. So there's two different types of cow-calf operations here in North Carolina where I work, and Virginia where I live and have my farm. And you can either be in the purebred business or the commercial business. And as you work with, as I work with a lot of different producers, a lot of small producers, there's a broad desire to be in the purebred business. It's kind of like dogs, do you want to raise a purebred AKC kind of a dog or do you want a mutt, that's a crossbred? And personally, I like the crossbreds, but there's a lot of people that want something that's pedigreed and that has breeding value that they can raise and sell puppies and that sort of thing. So you can think of it in a similar way. So the purebred or seed stock production does provide the genetic resources that the other people in the industry, the commercial people, use. And there are those that have very unique genetic resources we call those elite breeders. They're the ones that are really leading the way of developing new genetics and resulting in genetics improvement. And then we also have what are called multiplier breeders, and these are smaller, usually folks that there's a lot of them that simply use genetics from the elite breeders to expand those genetics for a greater reach to other producers. So they just basically take the genetics that are produced by the purebreds and they are multiplied. Contrast that with commercial production. The commercial production, the focus is on the production of good feeder calves, or in the case of local beef, good beef. We often use crossbred animals, and again we'll get to that later in the series to talk about the importance of crossbreeding. But they are more efficient, they live longer, they do better than the purebred animals, simply because of a concept we call hybrid vigor or heterosis. Again, we'll talk about that later. The other thing about commercial production, there's a lot less record keeping, a lot less paperwork, and usually less input. So a lot of purebred breeders have to spend a lot of money on different inputs to try to impress their customers or try to make sure that their animals look extra slick and fat and that sort of thing, and that's expensive. So commercial production is a little bit more efficient in terms of economic situation as well. Now, as you try to make that decision, I think that that's something that all producers that are new to the business that are really getting in need to go through that process. Do I really want to be in the purebred business or the commercial business? So the question is, how much time do you have to work with individual animals? In other words, are you the type that likes to look over an individual and their pedigree and think about how that individual might be improved? Or are you perhaps more interested in the herd of cattle, the population, as opposed to a single individual? How much time and interest do you have in working with records? Purebred production requires a lot of record keeping, a lot of entry of records and interpretation of records. And so just if you're a person that loves numbers and computers and stuff, then that may be for you. If you're not, if you're somebody that wants to be outside in the field most of the time, then commercial is probably a better choice. How much are you willing to invest in a long-term future? Purebred production success comes 20, 25, or 30 years into your existence. It's not something that comes quickly, and with commercial you can obviously be very productive in the short term. Other things that really for a successful purebred production, you have to use a high level of technology, especially in reproductive technology. Artificial insemination, embryo transfer, those are things that are very commonly used by the most successful purebred breeders and would be recommended if you joined in on that kind of production. I'll end by saying that the local beef producers that we have are almost always commercial producers. They are typically cow-calf farms that have developed a production system to take those calves on